Yes, this is Christopher Sabin from ONH Consulting. I wanted to welcome you to part 2 of this 3-part series I'm doing on YouTube on optic nerve hypoplasia and developmental and educational characteristics, strategies to foster educational development in the classroom. Today I'm going to focus on development, and I'm going to start discussing some of the roots of some of the behavioral and developmental challenges we have in the classroom and growing up in the community and dealing with such as far as our development. And just to review from the initial presentation, my earlier YouTube video, we discussed medical characteristics, we discussed what optic nerve hypoplasia is a failure of the optic nerve and related structures of the brain to develop during pregnancy. And we also discussed that the process that leads to the malformation or dysgenesis or absence of the optic nerve and related structures of the brain also impacts adjacent structures to where the optic nerve interfaces or connects to the brain, and that can include the hypothalamus and the thalamus, which are critical to self-regulation, homeostatic mechanisms, which are basically the body's ability to regulate itself, regulate body temperature, it's a sensory system, regulate the central nervous system, regulate behaviors, and more importantly, respiration, heart rate, etc. It can also affect vital hormone production as it relates to the pituitary gland, and you can have children with optic nerve hypoplasia and adults that have trouble producing vital hormones, everything from thyroid hormone to cortisol, which is critical to the body's ability to adapt well or at all to stress, to growth hormone, and other hormones that are vital to development, such as puberty, primary and secondary sex characteristics, etc. Now, there is one point that I believe I neglected to mention in my initial presentation, part 1 of this presentation, and that is there are actually 2 different diagnostic criteria that are associated with optic nerve that are associated with this condition. You may hear the optic nerve hypoplasia diagnosis used, but there is also a related diagnosis called septo-optic dysplasia. And children and adults who receive or are given the septo-optic dysplasia diagnosis have a structure of the brain that is missing or underdeveloped or malformed, what is referred to as an agenesis or dysgenesis in a section of the brain or structure called the septum pellucidum, which is a bridge that is near where the right and the left hemispheres of the brain divide. And we typically have very little understanding as to what the septum pellucidum actually does. Typically in septo-optic dysplasia, most clinicians would diagnose this, and it is also standard as far as how medical professionals diagnose mental disorders and physical disorders will diagnose septo-optic dysplasia in cases where there is optic nerve hypoplasia along with the absence or inability to produce two or more major hormones, such as, say, for example, cortisol and growth hormone. A child with that group of characteristics, or a child with that type of presentation, or what would be referred to as a phenotype, would receive the diagnosis. A doctor would diagnose that, or a team of medical professionals would diagnose that as septo-optic dysplasia. Now, there's a real significant debate. There was a lot of debate on whether or not septo-optic dysplasia and optic nerve hypoplasia are the same condition. Our standpoint is here at ONH Consulting, and many professionals that I deal with and many families believe that there is really no difference between ONH, optic nerve hypoplasia, and receptor optic dysplasia, and that a child with the SOD, receptor optic dysplasia diagnosis is just as much at risk of developing hormone deficiencies or developmental and behavioral characteristics such as autism, developmental delays, speech language delays, intellectual disabilities, sensory processing disorders, all that good stuff, which I'll get into later, as children who have that septum pellucidum intact or would be typically diagnosed with just optic nerve hypoplasia. And one of the leading researchers on ONH will refer to at some points during the rest of the series of presentations, the rest of this workshop, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Mark Borchert, who is Director of Ophthalmology at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. His standpoint is generally that there's really no difference, and that the SOD, receptor optic dysplasia diagnosis, should really be done away with by professionals. And it's also a pejorative connotation because SOD means sod, and you will hear him discuss if you hear or have a chance or have the opportunity to hear him speak at some of the workshops at some of the organizations such as Magic Foundation. You'll hear him say that children with ONH are not sods. They are not poor, they're not wretched or anything of that nature, using the British term. So the SOD should really be done away with. Now I'm going to spend the rest of this workshop, as well as all of the remaining workshop, all of part 3 of my workshop, which I'm going to be doing in the next week, focusing less on medical and more on how we develop in the classroom, how we operate in the community, and what all of the stuff I discussed in terms of all the medical jargon and so on and so forth, how that is going to affect us in the classroom, in the community, growing up developmentally, dealing with family, interacting with peers, getting along with other kids, and essentially overall development throughout the lifespan, particularly childhood and adulthood, the formative years developmentally. And that is a topic that unfortunately not as much has been done, not as much has been articulated in the professional literature. I'm going to give it, which leads me to some caveats that I want to discuss before I take a deep dive into sort of my own personal experiences and what I've observed with families. First of all, is that given the fact that there is relatively sparse literature and really professional publication on developmental behavioral characteristics, educational strategies, behaviors, sensory processing, all that good stuff, much of the information I'm going to be giving out in the rest of this workshop, this presentation as well as the next, is going to be based on my own experiences personally, living with optic nerve hypoplasia, as well as the experience of our families. This is going to necessarily mean that aspects of the condition might be overemphasized. I might overemphasize certain aspects of the condition and underemphasize others necessarily, just because there is going to be a fair amount of inherent bias in the rest of this presentation. Much of my own experience will cover a lot of what I'll discuss, or what I'll discuss in particular. And you have to understand that optic nerve hypoplasia is a huge spectrum. You have children who are developmentally on par with other same-age peers in pretty much all areas of development: speech, language, communication, daily living skills, social interaction, communication, etc. But may be totally blind. But they may be able to process Braille, and they may be able to handle fine motor skills, and may be able to learn a lot of the give and take of social interactions and interacting with peers. They may be able to tolerate such with very limited difficulties. I have kids with ONH who are directors, who are doctors, who have placed either won Braille challenges in different national Braille competitions, or have been very successful in that regard. But you also have children like me who struggle with Braille for various reasons, who struggle with fine motor skills, have limited communication skills, etc. You can have kids who are relatively visually intact, may have relatively good usable vision, but they have significant behavioral difficulties. They may have difficulty with handling day-to-day tasks. They may have trouble tolerating a lot of social interactions. They may have mental health disorders, bipolar disorder, attention deficit disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, etc. They may have mental health diagnoses that are, in many cases, poorly understood. I've seen kids and adults with ONH who have struggle with addiction, with substance abuse, with impulse control disorders, because their sensory systems, as I'll discuss in a minute, have a lot of difficulty. They can't tolerate, and they have a lot of difficulty processing what's going on in their environment, and so they act out aggressively. So, given all of this tangent that I'm discussing right now, ONH is extremely wide variety of characteristics, and it can impact children and adults in a wide variety of ways. So what I may discuss may be colored by my own experiences and may not apply to many of you watching this workshop or seeing this video. Second of all is that much of what I discuss may not be supported by the literature at this time. And from time to time during the rest of my workshop, I will discuss or may interject that this may be an area for research. Those of you who have the capacity or have the access to resources necessary to conduct research on our population or contribute to the literature, you may find in studying or observing or developing educational curricula or best practices for a group of our kids or one individual child, that what I have discussed may be totally irrelevant or it may be totally off base. 10 years from now, I may come back and we may come back and the literature may find something or may conclude something that is completely contradictory to something or points or various points in this workshop. And I understand that completely, and I encourage you to if you find any evidence or if you find any studies or personal experiences that refute or contradict or repudiate what I had to say in this workshop or in this presentations, please feel free to contact me, info@onhconsulting.com, or comment on this video, and feel free to make your opinions known, because this is an extremely diverse condition and there is going to be inherent bias, certainly. Finally, before I delve deeply into my experiences and sort of my take on the condition, understand that what I'm going to discuss in this presentation does not constitute medical advice. It does not constitute a professional opinion necessarily on any particular individual. I do provide consultation. I do provide advocacy services in some cases. I do offer community referrals and consultation. But much of it is based on personal experience. I do have a professional background. I do have a master's degree in social work, and I have done service coordination and case management for youth with chronic health conditions and other types of disabilities. I've done this professionally and do have some of that background that makes me credible. But this presentation, this workshop, is as much about indigenous workshop, as much about indigenous personal experience, as much an indigenous background as it is professional. It's as much personal as it is professional, so just bear that in mind. Now, you probably are more than ready to delve into the behavioral characteristics and developmental characteristics of optic nerve hypoplasia. And I'm going to start the heart and soul of this presentation by going into a little bit of my own areas of interest. And when I was a child, when I started about 3 or 4 years old, one of my areas of interest growing up, I do have autism characteristics, and I was provisionally diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder when I had graduated from college. It was in 2003 and had some difficulty in fitting in and dealing with some work-related issues on the job. Actually ended up losing a job in rehabilitation counseling, and I was diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified on a provisional basis. And I dealt with a lot of areas of interest, a lot of obsession, a lot of perseveration. And one of the things that I used to still do, actually, really fixate on is telephone sounds, the sounds of long distance communications, the sounds that telephone calls made when they traversed local and long distance networks through mechanical switches and long distance switches in the time frame when I was growing up, which would have been the 1970s and 1980s. And I typically like to tell families that the central nerve, I like to discuss or compare the central nervous system and the hypothalamus and all the brain structures that we discussed as a huge telephone network. And when you think about telephone networks and you think about what occurs in today's telecommunications system, you have voice, you have data, you have internet-based communications, you have high-speed internet, and so much of our communication system, so much of the day-to-day traffic, everything from banking, everything from controls such as street lights, traffic lights, everything from commerce, our credit card systems, to military and defense, to entertainment systems, cable TV, satellite TV, as well as social media and all of the things that we take for granted, such as web-based communication, email, as well as telephone communication, voice communication is internet-based. And it all flows through a very large and very intricate network of switches and fiber optic cables that run underground and telephone lines, and in many cases satellite communications. And much of the communications infrastructure is dependent on a number of switches that are physically located in different locations, that are in different places. And think of the brain, think of the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the central nervous system, the pituitary gland, which is basically the body's master gland, which I discussed earlier, as telephone switches in this vast communication system that spans not only single countries such as the United States, but more importantly, globally. Now just think of what would happen if one or a number of switches in a network were to crash or were to be affected by a natural disaster or a terrorist attack or some other event. Now, many of you may remember what happened in 9/11, when you had terrorists attack the World Trade Center, they attacked the Pentagon, and New York and Washington, D.C. are international choke points, if you will. A huge amount of voice and data communication passes through nodes, communication switches, telephone switches, and other switches, servers, data centers in Washington and New York, that were impacted by the terrorist attacks. You also had so much phone traffic, people trying to call relatives and others, that the cell phone system, the cell phone networks were jammed for days. Some of you may have had experiences, as I did, trying to coordinate professional activities or reach loved ones in Washington and New York, and there was no traffic whatsoever. I mean, there were no recordings or anything like that. You would just dial a number and it would be just dead air. It would just be silence. And it was, there were actually cases where telephone traffic was affected, but people were still able to communicate via email or via the rudimentary social networks that existed. You didn't have social media, you didn't have Facebook necessarily. At that point, Facebook was just beginning to take root at that point, but you had people using email and using other social networks at the time to communicate, and they were able to do this when other communication media failed. And this is a little bit like what happens in a child with optic nerve hypoplasia, where critical structures of the brain fail to develop properly, or in some cases didn't develop at all. Now, what I want you to do is imagine what would happen in a 4-year-old child who is, maybe they're blind, he or she is blind or has some limited vision. They may be dealing with nystagmus. They may have, he or she may have difficulty with critical body functions, either because they have trouble with self-regulation or because they have difficulty producing urine in controlled amounts. They may be peeing constantly because they have diabetes insipidus. They don't metabolize water effectively. Their brain doesn't process information that's coming into them through their senses. They may be able to not be able to process internal states in their body. So things that we just take for granted, such as bladder functions, such as wee-wee and poo-poo and stuff like that, may not necessarily work properly. They may not have the language to understand what wee-wee and poo-poo is. They may not be able to communicate. They may have trouble processing speech and language. They may have difficulty being able to move their mouth in the proper way so that they can make themselves understood, as was the case until I was about 3. I was unable to speak, or I had essentially different modes of speech that weren't understood, but I wasn't able to communicate or didn't have the skills to be understood verbally until I was 3 years old. I wasn't speaking until I was 3 because of, in my case, it was difficulty with really motor movements. It was a motor issue. You may have kids that had difficulty with that. You may have a child that may have difficulty with a taste or smell. They may constantly be in a state of arousal. They may be constantly insecure in their environment. They're constantly responding to everything and anything in their environment negatively. They're constantly paranoid. They're constantly insecure. They're constantly in a state of, geez, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? They may be hypervigilant. They may have difficulty understanding. Most importantly, they may have difficulty understanding that others around them don't feel as they do. They may not have the capability of understanding that, gee, my parents, my older brother, my sister, my other kids in my play group, my teacher, my grandma, my grandpa, my mima, Miss Frank, that is my teacher that visits me every day, that she doesn't feel the same way I do. And there are things that I don't have access to or can't really process or really have no concept of because I can't see. I don't see the beeping toys, or I don't see videos such as Elmo or such as Dora the Explorer, what have you, or whatnot, because I just don't have access to that. I don't have the concept of what vision is. And most importantly, because my world, my ability to really process is so out of whack and so crazy, I may not really want to understand what other people are thinking, because I'm so focused on things that I can process and I can gravitate to. And I may be so anxious and so constantly wired all the time that I might need things such as music, or such as some type of stimulation like a person's voice, so that I can process information, so I can understand the world around me and stay calm, like a port in a storm. And those are the things that typically develop into areas of interest. So what I want to really impress upon you is that these are the kinds of things that are very difficult for a lot of our kids to process. And from the standpoint of a 3-year-old child who their communication is really limited, they may not really have the wherewithal or the understanding or the cognitive or developmental mindset to understand and to process, and that needs to be developed or encouraged through various means. There are many aspects of this condition that are really sort of inherent in ONH in a lot of cases. Generally speaking, I believe the statistic is that 81% of children with optic nerve hypoplasia have some type of developmental delays. In bilateral, it's 81%, which is in both eyes. In children with unilateral ONH, which is ONH in the one eye, it is 78%. And these delays can range everything from difficulty with fine motor skills, being able to learn really basic skills such as grooming, such as buttoning, such as tying. I really wasn't able to tie my shoe effectively until I was almost in high school, to communication, walking, ambulation, crawling, walking. We have kids that are unable to walk or crawl. They haven't mastered that concept. They may need assistance from a walker. They may need to use a wheelchair. They may be unable to sit up on their own because of sensory processing difficulties. I've actually had kids, in my case, I was able to walk on my own when I was 20 months, but I didn't walk unassisted. I was constantly holding on to objects at 9 months, but didn't have the wherewithal or necessarily the balance necessary to walk unassisted without holding on to objects until I was 20 months old, which is, I've seen kids that don't walk until they're 4 or 5 or older. And the same goes for communication. The same goes for speech-language difficulties and speech-language delays. Typically in our kids, with me in particular, receptive language, which is being able to understand what others say to me, what my parents said to me, is not affected as much. However, expressive language, I'll give you an example. When I was 10 months old, my mom asked me to show me the monster, and I knew what a monster was. I loved the monster. I would scrunch up my face and do like a monster. But I was unable to speak the word monster because of really being able to understand how to move my mouth to make myself understood, until I started attending a program basically a summer program for toddlers, infants and toddlers with developmental disabilities. And this is, mind you, this is back in 1976 and 77, where we're pretty much in the dark ages when it came to a lot of developmental characteristics, and certainly sensory processing and autism. We had really no clue what a lot of that was back then. But I remember when I was learning how to speak, I essentially had two different methods, two different modalities of speaking. And the method I preferred to use was an esophageal type speech that sounded like humming. I remember I used to talk like this is what I was saying, and it sounded like humming. And that's how I talked until I was 3, about 2.5 to 3 years old. And it was through a particularly understanding instructor that knew that there was something there, that knew I wasn't intellectual. I was actually being tested, or they recommended to my parents that I be tested for intellectual disabilities, what was at the time referred to as mental retardation. And this teacher understood that no, I wasn't mentally retarded, that I was using different means of communication, and that I needed to learn how to speak verbally. And at that point, I was able to speak at the age of 3, and I actually went from no speech to complete sentences, because by that point, I had understood what a sentence was. I was using sentence structure pretty much independently, but I was not speaking in a way that that others could understand me. Other types of difficulties that are very common in ONH are autism characteristics. You might have a child who demonstrates, a lot of kids who are blind or have other disability, other types of visual impairment, or other degrees of visual impairment, I should say, will demonstrate what used to be referred to as blindisms, but I refer to them as self-stimulatory behaviors. That's the term that I typically like to use, self-stimulatory behaviors. You may also hear these types of behaviors referred to as repetitive stereotyped behaviors, or stereotyped repetitive behaviors. That's a clinical term that is used in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for mental disorders, which is sort of the gold standard that clinicians use to diagnose mental health conditions. And that is a particularly difficult behavior for a lot of us to manage. I used to rock like this and flap my hands and do this, constantly flap. And those were particularly difficult behaviors for me to extinguish for a number of reasons, because the way that the way that my brain was wired and the way that my central nervous system was wired, I needed that stimulation. And as I'll get into later, it took 8 years of occupational therapy and daily living skills, and the list goes on, to extinguish these behaviors. And I still have impulses to engage in some of this stuff in private. Communication, getting back to speech and language. Communication of children with optic nerve hypoplasia can be, it can either be very difficult, it can either be very stunted, it can be delayed. I don't like to use the word stunted. It can be delayed, it can be unusual, and it can also be non-existent in some cases. There are a lot of children who don't speak verbally, that they may use some other type of modality of communication, or some other form of communication, such as sign language, or they may need to be able to use augmentative communication devices. There are a number of augmentative or alternative communication systems that exist for children with autism or speech and language communication. The speech and communication of children with optic nerve hypoplasia can involve or can include many different characteristics. Some of them, a lot of our kids, including me, engage in what is called echolalia, referred to as echolalia. Echolalia is the repetition of words that are spoken to them. When a child, for example, when an adult asks a child, for example, do you want a cookie? They, instead of responding yes or no, they may simply say, do you want a cookie? Do you want a cookie? Do you want a cookie? And they may say that, they may repeat that. In my case, in a lot of other cases, they may repeat it in sort of a sing-song or musical manner, in a repetitive way, in sort of a repetitive sing-song manner. This is referred to as echolalia, and there are two types of echolalia that are documented in literature. One of them is delayed, and the other one is immediate. Immediate echolalia is, the typical example of, when a child is when somebody asks a child, an adult, or do you want a cookie? And the kid responds, do you want a cookie? Or do you want a cookie? Do you want a cookie? And this is referred to as immediate, and it is basically the child parroting back what the adult hears, or what he hears, or what he or she perceives. And my hypothesis, or just sort of my take on that, is because they have difficulty, the kid has difficulty processing information. They have difficulty understanding that what is being said to them requires a response. They may have difficulty coding the words that the adult is using, do you have a cookie, into the meanings necessary. They may have trouble understanding or processing the grammar and the syntax necessary to understand that this is a question, this is an interrogative statement. Do you want a cookie? And instead of answering, they may be processing that statement or processing that group of stimuli in repetitive fashion in order to process that information for later retrieval to when they can actually retrieve it and they can actually respond or really comprehend what is being said. And the processing, I like to refer to it as sort of like when you deal with a computer copying the same file over and over into different software packages, or like if you're trying to open a file like a PDF or a Word document or something like that, and one application has trouble reading the file, say for example the PDF readers that you installed on your laptop or your smart device didn't install properly, you might get an error message or a prompt from the operating system to ask you what application do you want to open this file. Is it Adobe, which is a PDF reader, or is it some other application such as Pages that will work with PDFs or Word docs or what have you? And echolalia is a little bit like that process where the kid is they're just repeating in sort of an infinite loop, this and this and this and this and this, and it can be self-stimulatory in that a child may have trouble with being able to redirect because they're constantly processing. It can actually be very pleasurable for that child because of the processing involved. And this can occur on an immediate basis or in delayed echolalia, which is the other type of echolalia that is referred to in the literature. It can occur on at a later time. For the child is asked, do you want a cookie? Well, maybe the next day or a half an hour later or some other point during the day, they may all of a sudden respond out of the blue, do you want a cookie? Do you want a cookie? Do you want a cookie? And in my case, it can be a very sing-songy kind of a speech, and it might be, do you want a cookie? 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 And this is what I used to do. And this typically, the reason I would do this is because while I was processing information, I was kind of using that speech to process that question, do you want to cookie, that interrogative statement. I would process each word in that sentence in terms of a series of musical tones. And when I was 2 or 3 years old, I had musical interest. And in my case, I was actually, I still do have perfect pitch, or what's referred to as absolute pitch. Many of our children do have absolute pitch or perfect pitch. And I actually had tones that I would associate with different words, or in most cases, different phonemes. And these associations actually got very specific. For example, the word thousand, for example, is associated with the key B, which is the thousand. That's the key of B. And I had associations for pretty much all of the major phonemes in the English language. And I do not remember when I came up with these associations. So this is beyond conscious memory. And my belief is that I developed these associations before 18 months, at least earlier than 2, at least when I was younger than 2, possibly as young as 18 months. It was beyond conscious memory. This leads me to a third type of echolalia, which is not documented in the literature. This is something I'm proposing on my own. And I call this type of echolalia associative echolalia. Associative echolalia is, in my context, where a child with echolalia demonstrates that they're talking to themselves and they're repeating because they're trying to associate, they're trying to make sense of the world by associating a given phoneme or a given communication pattern with something in their previous experience. And I'll get to this in a little bit. Previous experience and referential communication, things that refer to past stimuli, is very, very important to me, and I have reason to believe may be important to a lot of other kids with ONH, just based on what I've heard from families and some of the kids that I've talked to directly and what have you. Of course, I can't verify this or can't confirm this because many of our kids can't articulate. They don't have the executive functioning, or they don't have the reasoning to understand how others feel and be able to articulate it certainly as well as I can, and some of the other adults that are out there who are on the social networks that I'm a part of and can communicate and articulate. So I encourage you, if you're a speech language professional, or anyone who is a neuropsychologist or a neurolinguist, or an autism professional who has experience or has a research background, to delve into associations between different stimuli, associating from one word to another in a child's past experience, and this whole construct of associative echolalia, to go to it. And feel free to comment on this if you develop any studies, and feel free to shoot this concept down too, or construct it down, if it seems like it's off base. But this is my own sort of take on communication. I spent a lot of time on echolalia and speech and language. Another characteristic of speech and language that I've experienced, and is still actually a part of my life to this day, is what are referred to as neologisms. Neologisms are, of course, that's a fancy term to refer to made-up words. And I have a lot of made-up words for different events in my life. And I've seen this in a lot of children with ONH, or some children with ONH, who have differences in communication or delays in communication. For example, I had a number of words that I made-up words or made-up constructs that I used to refer to different events and different and different experiences that were very specific. For example, Aigafour, and I always spell this Aightaffour. Currently, I spell this, whenever I refer to this internally, Atifor, Aigafour. Aigafour is a term I used to use to refer to a context in which seeing someone, such as a favorite teacher or a relative, it usually had to do with adults or other communications. I'll get into adults or preferred individuals, was most likely to occur, or likely to occur, or could occur, or should occur. For example, a visiting grandma's house might be an example. For example, might be an Aigafour for grandma. Going to a particular grocery store where I knew I would run into a specific teacher in the past, I might refer to that as an Aigafour for that particular teacher. And an Aigafour can also mean an association, such as wanting to refer to wanting to meet a certain teacher and then going to a context or going to a situation to make that happen. I may also refer to that as an Aigafour, or a certain activity, such as going to a specific class or going to a meeting might also be an Aigafour for a particular individual. So this is a term that I would use to refer to particular contexts or particular situations or particular events in which working or meeting or having contact or having interaction with a specific individual was either likely to occur or about to occur. Another fairly common word that I'll be referring to is asphyxiate, Axiate, and that is a term that referred to a past experience. And that actually relates to how a lot of our kids process information. Certainly, I used to process information referred to as asphyxiates, which is basically a processing or understanding things as related to a past experience. And these things typically tend to be very specific, and they tend to be much more important to me than any individual component. There's a word, of course, some of you may know what the term Gestalt means. Gestalt means that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that is, in many cases, what I would refer to as asphyxiate. So you have a child, for example, that might have a teacher's, a specific voice or a specific means of communication that a teacher uses, or a musical instrument, or a particular song, such as singing the goodbye song at the end of a day, for example. That might be a child might have a particular gestalt or a particular asphyxiate, if you will, for how he or she is used to that song being sung on any particular day. And anything that deviates from that schema or that picture, that overall picture of how that song how he or she is used to that song being sung, may be very difficult for that child to process. They may have difficulty, and this is one of the reasons why you see a lot of kids that have trouble with transitions, because they may have difficulty dealing with changes, because anything that fits outside of their overall context or overall sort of shape of how things ought to work in their environment at that particular time, anything that deviates from that can be very difficult for them to process. It can cause a lot of anxiety, it can cause a lot of stress, and it can also be very difficult for that child to really tolerate, and it can really cause a lot of behaviors. A lot of children have difficulty with transitions, and for that very reason. And in my context, I actually remember when I was in preschool, in the program that I attended growing up for 3 summers at the program for for kids with developmental disabilities, I actually had a specific musical tone for each hour of the day, from 12 p.m. to 11 a.m., and of course that would repeat from 12 p.m. To 11 p.m. That each hour in that 12-hour sequence, going around the clock 24 hours, had a very specific tone, a very specific context. And I do remember having meltdowns when certain things wouldn't occur at a specific time that would refer to that particular musical tone. And I say this because it is fairly well documented that a lot of children with ONH have significant difficulty with transitions. They may have difficulty understanding that when one activity is over and when another activity begins. They don't have some type of cue or reminder or schema or some kind of reference point to understand where that activity ends and where the next activity begins. It may be extremely difficult, and it may cause a lot of untoward behaviors. And I have to say that for me, I had some difficulty with transitions, not as much as a lot of kids, but I also do remember having difficulty with understanding different schemas and understanding when things didn't fit into my world, especially when I was up in 1st and 2nd grade, where a lot of the kids I work with are developmentally. It used to cause a lot of problems. I do remember having meltdowns and behaviors related to that. Autism characteristics is the next topic I wanted to discuss. Kids with ONH in general have a lot of many, as much as 50%, according to some literature, operate at some level on the autism spectrum, either have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, ASD, or could qualify for a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. And in my case, and in most other cases, a child who has autism spectrum disorders, of course, they have typically difficulty with speech language, communication, interaction, that they may withdraw, or they may have a lot of difficulty with, they may be passive, where a lot of other blind children, even other blind children, engage, they're willing to explore, they're willing to seek out their environment. A lot of our kids typically tend to just sort of go off and just sort of do whatever. They may go off into their own world. They may sing a favorite song. And it may be either a TV commercial, or they may be concentrated on telephone sounds, as I was, or a favorite video. I know kids, and I certainly did this, who memorize videos or memorize articles. I used to use the talking book players. I had the old flexible disc players when I was a kid that were actually records that you would actually put on a turntable and listen to talking books, listen to books or magazines that would be produced by in the United States, the National Library Service for the Blind and Physically Handicapped. This is how far back it goes. And I remember a couple of cases that there were articles I used to listen to from National Geographic or what have you that I had on these flexible discs. I actually had memorized and would repeat these, or would say this on a regular basis, sort of without a lot of regard to what others, how it was affecting my interaction, or what others were processing, or others' perspectives. I would just go off and memorize these articles. I remember one particular article on hurricanes, and there was another article on on lead. This is back when unleaded gasoline was first being introduced to the market in the late 70s, and there was an article on lead exposure that I actually memorized when I was in first grade. It was from a particular magazine. It came out in 1980 and the time frame. So autism characteristics: difficulty with speech and language. You may have difficulty understanding the perspective of others, understanding a poor executive functioning, what was referred to in the literature as poor executive functioning. Impulsivity, constantly back and forth, constantly fixated on different types of activities, unable to control impulses, meltdowns, behaviors. Oh my goodness, behaviors, meltdowns. In my case, it was crying. I would go into crying fits or crying spells when either I was overstimulated or stressed or frustrated or had difficulty or anxious or what have you. Have a crying spell, literally. And that in particular made life up until I was maybe in 8th grade, 9th grade, very difficult, if not impossible. Crying all the time. I had particular meltdowns as far as that is concerned. And I also had, and a lot of our kids have, obsessions, which are very typical in autism. Usually, when a child with autism who is blind or visually impaired, has a area of interest or obsesses on something. A lot of kids with autism obsess on what are referred to as areas of interest or given topics, be it trains, be it automobiles, be it Disney characters or a particular sports star like LeBron James, for example, or Lord of the Rings or what have you, are the things that a lot of kids on the autism spectrum and adults can really get fixated on and obsess on. And a lot of kids with optic nerve hypoplasia, that area of interest is something that is musically based or something having to do with sound. It can either be a particular musical group or a particular artist. In my case, my areas of interest were Linda Ronstadt, the Carpenters, Howard Jones, which was a particular new wave synth pop group in the 80s, actually used to obsess on Things Can Only Get Better, which was the main popular song that he produced in 1985 from an album called Dream Into Action, which is an absolute fixation. And I'll tell you, not a lot of our kids were into Howard Jones, obviously. This was back in 1980. I mean, you had certainly Madonna, and you had Prince, and you had breakdancing, and all that good stuff. I remember A View to a Kill was popular. Arnold Schwarzenegger was really popular, sort of on the side. I never understood. My coordination was so bad. I never understood how a kid could breakdance. All this moving around and stuff like that, breakdancing. I mean, how could a kid do that? That was the question I used to have. At that point, I had all this fixation, and Howard Jones was pretty much all I could talk about for about almost 2 years. It was actually my first concert was a Howard Jones concert at one of our venues. My dad actually was in line for, I think it was 2 hours, I believe it was, getting, as soon as the park opened, getting me tickets to this concert, and I was in 7th grade. But I digress as far as that goes. And my point being in discussing this is I've seen this with a lot of kids with ONH. I've seen particular contexts, particular music videos, such as Royal Engagement or Chronicles of Narnia, for example. I'm thinking of one child in particular, the Food Network, Pioneer Woman was one young lady's particular obsession or area of interest. And what they do is they develop schemas or these gestalts, or what I was referred to as asphyxiates. And anything that would deviate from the way that character would be presented would absolutely throw them off and cause them to have meltdowns, and cause them behaviors. And I wanted to get into some of the characteristics or some of the developmental quirks or some of the oddities or unique aspects of some kids with autism that can be strengths or what can be considered splinter skills, or what I refer to as specialized innate skills. That's a term that I use. Most people would refer to as savant skills, sort of special little pockets or islands of ability that some children with ONH do have and do possess. It's sort of that sort of are archives or sort of artifacts of autism, or sort of this weird, or sort of this different sensory process. I use the word weird sort of lovingly, not in a pejorative sense, obviously, but sort of these differences in the way that we process information. There are kids that have profound musical ability. I know of a child who can, actually a few adults who can compose their own music, who have a very innate sense of musical structure and composition, that have absolute pitch, but also had the ability to, if you play a particular song, even a very complex classical composition, such as a piece by Brahms or Mozart or Irving Berlin or what have you, they were able to produce that word for word or mimic that particular composition note by note, and they may do that, and they're able to do that with some degree of accuracy or total accuracy, complete accuracy, and they do it with no deviation. If a child, if they hear a mistake or an error in the performance, that will also get incorporated into the performance. And there are actually a number of cases of what it typically referred to as idiot savants in the 19th century, early 20th century, or people with savant skills. There are a number of cases throughout history, such as Leslie Lemke, when it comes to mind. There was an African-American slave by the name of Blind Tom Wiggins that demonstrated actually a performer in the minstrel era in the 19th century who was totally blind and had some of these characteristics, and it was very well known that he rocked and flapped his hands, and there are some indications that possibly he has ONH as well. I wanted to get more generally into self-regulation. Can be very difficult. Behaviors can be very difficult for them to manage, and it can also, as I'll get into later under educational strategies, it can be very difficult for that child to regulate when something goes wrong or something goes amiss in their environment, or anxious or overstimulated. And a lot of our kids can act out. A lot of our kids can do what I did and just sort of withdraw or just sort of cry and what have you. I've seen kids that have physically gotten aggressive, that have locked themselves in the bathroom, that have dealt with a lot of those other characteristics, that have done some self-injurious behavior. I wanted to discuss some of these behaviors as well, because self-injurious behavior is something that I know a lot of people have discussed, and something that a lot of individuals have dealt with, and it can be extremely problematic. And that can be physically based. I believe that most children who engage in self-injurious behavior, just from my own experience, do it because there is something wrong in their environment. There is something that they can't process. And they may be experiencing physical symptoms such as fatigue, or they may have a severe headache, because a lot of children have hypoglycemia. They may have difficulty with metabolizing water, so they may be constantly thirsty, they may be constantly hungry, they may have a constant headache, as I did, because of the some of the they may have trouble processing things visually. They may be experiencing a lot of eye strain, and typically, because of difficulty with self-regulation, because they have difficulty processing information effectively, what they may experience might be 100 times more intense or 100 times magnified than what a typically developed person, what you as a parent or you as a teacher might be experiencing. And the only way that that child, from their perspective, mind you, their communication is limited, or even if they can communicate, they may need to resort that to some of these things that to blow off steam or relieve stress, or to process, might be to redirect that pain or redirect that stimulus into something else. And a really great way of doing that is by banging your head on the table, or, as I did, biting my finger until it was raw, or scratching myself until my ear or my back or what have you, the skin of my back was raw and it constantly itches. It caused it to constantly itch. It's really stimulating. Or in another child who had a lot of regulatory issues, screaming at the top of her lungs to the extent that she developed nodules on her vocal cords because she didn't know how to regulate what was appropriate speech, and she would scream a lot of times to stimulate, because what she was experiencing was very difficult for her to tolerate, and the only way she could vent that, the only way she could redirect that would be to scream in that manner. And the only way I can really describe it, or the only metaphor I can describe it, is imagine what it would be like if you stubbed your toe, except multiply that by 1,000, and then sustain that for hours on end. Typically, and just think of, when you stub your toe, you kind of get that little tingly, kind of uncomfortable sense, that sensation. There's actually a receptor that it takes about a half a second for that pain receptor to kick in, and there's that sort of little weird period there for about half a second where you're not really in pain, but you're in discomfort. And just imagine that multiplied by thousands, and the kid is trying to redirect. And in order to redirect, they're trying to match the intensity of that experience, or what they're experiencing. And the only way they can do that is by maybe hitting their head like this or banging their head on the table. And that, of course, is not only socially inappropriate, socially unacceptable, but can also lead to self-harm and self-injury. And it's a behavior that needs to be addressed. So I could discuss this more at length, but that is basically the gist of some of the behaviors. Now I'm going to sort of wrap up this section of this presentation by talking about really what sensory processing disorder is and how it can be addressed, and some of the behaviors, some of the techniques that I use to manage behaviors, as I'll discuss in the next section. But essentially I refer to sensory processing, and sensory integration is another term that is used. And sensory processing is really at the root of a lot of behaviors, everything from the rocking, your self-stimulatory behaviors I discussed earlier, to meltdowns. The trouble with self-regulation really has to do with difficulty understanding and processing and dealing with stimuli that actually comes into the body through the senses. Sensory processing disorder is typically what is referred to as sensory processing disorder, sort of a catch-all term for differences in the body's ability to detect, discriminate, modulate, integrate, or identify, in many cases, information that is coming in from the environment, that is coming into the body through the senses from the environment. And we talk about sensory integration or sensory processing disorder, Typically, the term that is used is sensory processing disorders. We look at the five senses, taste, touch, sight, hearing, and smell, the typical five senses. But we also refer to three additional senses, one of them being what is referred to as proprioception. And proprioception is the ability to recognize where the body's position in space, the speed that it is traveling, if it is traveling in like for example, if you're moving, the body's position in space, the speed that it is traveling, how the body's the different parts of the body relate to each other, you're putting one foot in front of another, what have you. That is referred to as proprioception. And proprioception is a term, it actually comes from the Latin for to take one's own. And difficulties in proprioception can make it very difficult to, say for example, if you're blind, it can affect everything from fine motor skills, being able to tie my shoes. I actually wasn't able to tie my shoes until I was almost in high school, and really to this day, it's difficult for me to understand how a typically developed child, even one who doesn't have a lot of the sensory processing issues like I do, it's difficult for me to understand how can a blind person, or how can anybody learn how to tie their shoes when they're 4? I mean, 4 and 5 years old. It's extremely difficult to, understand that concept. And I understand, I've actually talked to some adults with ONH who have, some of the same background that I did growing up, that, learning how to tie their shoe is as difficult as getting a master's degree. It's as difficult for them as going through graduate school or an academic program. It is that involved. And that has to do with difficulty with proprioception. Proprioception can also make a lot of other daily living skills, such as dressing, such as grooming, brushing your teeth, for example, very difficult, if not impossible. Now, in terms of overall blindness skills, I wanted to get into that because I feel like I kind of overemphasized a lot of the autism characteristics and what have you, and I wanted to talk about how this all can affect blindness skills. Proprioception can really wreak havoc on your ability to learn Braille, decode the Braille letters. Essentially, Braille is it's a code. It consists of different configurations of 6 dots on a page that are arranged spatially in ways that refer to or that symbolize not only the letters of the alphabet, but whole words. You have whole word signs, you have contractions, and in many cases, parts of words can be denoted in Braille with with contractions, with different words, with different configurations of Braille dots. Like for example, for the word forever, F-O-R-E-V-E-R, for example, can be denoted in Braille by a whole word sign, which symbolizes the word for, followed by, or compounded by, a sign, a specific, what's referred to as a .5 sign for the word ever, F-O-R, for, which is a Braille cell, followed by the .5 sign for ever, which happens to be a .5, followed by the letter E, forever, which means ever. So for, the full Braille cell, followed by .5e, means forever in Braille. And I refer to this, and this is contracted Braille, or grade 2 Braille, which is what literary Braille actually is. And it takes a lot of processing to decode what Braille actually is, or to be able to read with any confidence the Braille code. And if you have fine motor discrimination difficulties, or if you have difficulty with proprioception, or the ability to take in information tactually, it can be extremely difficult to decode Braille effectively without specific interventions, occupational therapy, or, in some cases, I've reason to think that some kids may also benefit from interventions for kids without blindness who may have specific learning disabilities, so that they can better process or they can better code Braille. I actually remember when I went to a preschool for kids with visual impairment, with blindness, and I had one of the best teachers in the state of Ohio, actually the best teachers of the visually impaired. Mind you, this is back in 1979, and I remember using the old Lippincott Braille children's Braille series called the Lippincott series. And I remember being totally overstimulated and having a series of meltdowns and just being totally not in a good place. It was the afternoon of a particular rough day, and my teacher was saying to this other kid that was in my program, who actually is a guy I know to this day who's somewhat active in the organized blind movement. He actually works now in an IT capacity for the Social Security Administration, but I digress, in another part of Ohio. But I remember his teacher was basically telling this kid that if he can't recognize E, he wouldn't be able to, the letter E in Braille, he wouldn't be able to go to his local school district. And so there was a lot of pressure, and I remember the word horse, Horse, having this complete crying meltdown because I had trouble recognizing the letter E, the .15, if those of you familiar with Braille. And it was just so frustrating for me. And I was introduced to the Perkins Braille in the first grade, and never never learned the Perkins Braille, just because my coordination skills, my fine motor skills were so limited, were so poor. And we actually decided to not focus on Braille. Instead we focused on vision, and I used a CCTV all through grade school and high school and adult. And fortunately, sheer grit and willpower and possibly divine intervention, I was able to learn the basics of Braille and begin reading Braille, literary Braille, as an adult. So I do read Braille fluently. My speed isn't the greatest, I will admit, but I do read Braille and can actually process it, and was actually able to process it until when I was about in 9th grade. I wanted to conclude this section of this presentation by talking about the different types of sensory processing disorder, because there are actually 3 different types of sensory processing disorder, and each of these has different subtypes. The 3 types are sensory discrimination disorder, sensory modulation disorder, and sensory-based motor disorder. And start with sensory discrimination disorder, or sensory-based discrimination disorder. Really is difficulty understanding or discriminating different stimuli, being able to discriminate and respond appropriately to the stimuli that comes into the environment, being able to use or coordinate both hands to use a knife and fork while cutting, or understanding Braille on a page, or being able to, for example, if you're blind, one of the critical skills learning as a blind person to learn is cane travel. Being able to arc your cane from side to side, and being able to process and interact effectively with what that cane is telling you, and using proper technique, or specific techniques that you use when using a cane. There's touch technique. There's a specific there's specific grips that are used. There are actually several different grips that are used, as well as different techniques that you use in different situations. Everything from from two-point touch technique to touch and slide to diagonal technique to squaring off to ascending and descending stairs to stair technique, shorelining, all that good stuff. And it's different techniques that we use. And in order to be able to use a cane effectively and be able to switch from one technique to another, you have to be able to process the information that your cane is giving you about the environment, whether or not the terrain is uneven, is it even, is it gravel, is it asphalt, is it blacktop, if you're inside, is there a wall, are there walls that are in front of you, are there open spaces, it might be classrooms or it might be offices, are there obstacles in front of you such as poles or intersecting hallways that you might need to be able to determine, take a right on this hallway and find the elevators, for example. So that may be very difficult if you have trouble with sensory discrimination. And children or have trouble modulating and discriminating information in the environment. Sensory-based modulation disorder is another disorder that is typically found in kids and adults with sensory processing disorders. In sensory modulation disorder, you can either be over-responsive, under-responsive, or sensory-seeking. Sensory modulation disorder can really involve reacting adequately to the environment and understanding and appropriately in an adaptive manner to what is going on in that child's world. And child with a lot of kids, typically what I've seen as far as kids with ONH are concerned, a lot of kids with ONH tend to be over-responsive. There are actually three different types of sensory modulation disorders: the over-responsive, under-responsivity, and sensory seeking. And a lot of kids with ONH typically are over-responsive, or they may demonstrate all three of these characteristics in just certain degrees in different contexts. For example, in my case, I tend to be very over-responsive. If something is right in front of me, for example, or the phone will ring, I will immediately, that will automatically grab my attention, and I will need to focus on that until that is resolved. I have had cases where, even to this day, if somebody touches me in the wrong way, I will yell. I will just flinch. And that, a lot of kids typically will respond, and that's a proprioceptive over-responsivity, which is basically my proprioceptive sense is very over. It's basically it's very sensitive. It's like an alarmist too. It's alarmist extremely sensitive, and it can be very difficult sometimes in social settings. Like this, constantly if somebody just touches me, I can in some cases react somewhat aggressively or somewhat violently in some cases. Kids with ONH who are over-responsive, they may react negatively. They may have meltdowns. That they may have essentially be able to unable to process auditory stimuli at certain frequencies. If a car honks a mile away, it can literally throw them into a tizzy. I have a kid, for example, that I work with his family that, particular sound on a video cassette recorder. They use VHS, but also DVDs, and there would be like a specific tone that was used at the beginning of a movie, and I would barely notice. A lot of our kids, like for example me or somebody who's typically developed, would barely notice these particular sounds, and I barely noticed, but it would throw this kid into an absolute meltdown. We have kids that can hear sounds such as car alarms, for example, or sounds of particular frequencies like traffic sounds or barking dogs or Just imagine gunshots, for example. They can hear those a mile away, and they may have difficulty responding to that without going into absolute meltdown. There is actually a term for that. It's referred to as hyperacusis, and they need to have therapies or interventions for that because it is that difficult for them to process. Sensory, I discussed underresponsivity is when the body, you're basically just, you have really no awareness or don't respond as much as you should to sensory stimuli. And I typically don't have that much experience with that except for some types of self-stimulation, self-stimulatory behaviors, which is something a little bit different, but typically our kids don't tend to be as much, from my experience, under-responders. But however, that is a type of sensory discrimination issue, or a type of sensory discrimination disorder that is documented. And a lot of our kids have trouble responding appropriately to certain activities. And finally, the third type of disorder, or type of sensory discrimination disorder, is what's referred to as sensory seeking. Now that's a biggie in us. Sensory seeking is when your body craves, or sensory craving is when your body craves certain stimulation, and that is a big part of rocking or hand flapping. And I want to say about hand flapping, rocking, your self-stimulatory behaviors. In blindness, in a blindness context, a lot of children who are blind and have other types of disabilities engage in these behaviors. Even typically developed children who are blind engage in these behaviors, even kids who don't have ONH or aren't as affected by some of the neurological differences associated with ONH. However, whereas the behaviors can be outgrown over time, a lot of kids outgrow rocking, hand flapping, or a lot of blind people I've worked with, or a lot of blind children I've worked with, never really feel the need to engage in these behaviors at all. Where that might be the case for a lot of blind kids, they may just outgrow it or really never have any kind of need to engage in the behaviors. A lot of us need specific and ongoing and repetitive interventions to really deal with these types of behaviors. And as I'll get into in the concluding part of my presentation, which I hope to release next week, I actually had to develop specific strategies to learn how to extinguish the behaviors, extinguish rocking, stop rocking, stop hand flapping my hands, and engaging in these types of behaviors. And those efforts on my part, I was able to get rid of the behaviors, I was able to extinguish them, but they led to some other complications which I dealt with, and I actually had a recurrence of rocking, actually started engaging in behavior again at a couple of points during my professional career, just because the professional stress got to that extent. And I consider rocking a specific type of sensory seeking or sensory craving behavior. You may also have children who require or need or really take a lot of pleasure in or fixate on physical experiences such as roller coasters, such as being thrown into the pool, such as diving, such as participating in sports or recreational activities. And for those types of kids, those are the kids that you may need to get them engaged in sporting or recreation, anything from riding a horse, from equestrian type activities, which I'll discuss next time, to martial arts, to swimming, to other types of exercise, such as tandem bicycling, so that they can process information that is coming to them through the senses. discuss sensory discrimination disorder, sensory modulation disorder, and the third type of disorder, which is a type of sensory processing disorder that can really be an issue with our kids, is referred to as sensory motor disorder. Sensory motor disorder is really the ability to the body to understand or to process information that is coming to it in relation to motor functioning. And in my case, I had there was actually two different types of sensory motor disorders. One of them is postural disorder, and the other one is referred to as dyspraxia. And I will demonstrate this from my own personal experiences because I've had both and continue to deal with both really to this day. Postural disorder is the body's inability to position it to perceive where it is in space and to position itself or understand where each body part is positioned in relative to each other, relative to other parts of the body, and where it is positioned in space. And so a child with ONH, like me, for example, who has postural disorder, may slouch. Really, to this day, my favorite position is to either lie down in a prone position or be like this, which is slouching, which is totally inappropriate. I was in up until I was in 8th grade, I used to keep my head down on a desk constantly because of other, really, the whole process, the whole act of just getting through a day with sensory processing disorder. It can be exhausting. It can be very difficult, and it can be, really, it can be taxing. And one of the things that I would do is keep my head down on the desk so that I could really focus on what my teachers were saying, and I could pay attention in class or really even think in class. And the other thing I would do, besides my posture being completely atrocious, I went through 8 years of physical and occupational therapy and had poor muscle. My muscle tone was also very poor. A lot of kids with ONH have poor muscle tone. But one of the things that I used to do up until maybe I was in, I think, 9th grade, and I will admit to you, I still find myself doing this to this day, is I used to cut my hands like this on my chin, like this, or like typically like this. And I had a 3rd grade teacher who, I was in a mainstream class all through grade school and high school, and she was not the greatest teacher, not one of my favorites. She was kind of a witch. But she used to tease me in front of all the other students that it used to look like I was trying to hold my head up. And it looked like I was trying to keep my head from falling off. And I remember feeling this almost a grating sensation. Like fingernails on a blackboard, just trying to keep my head straight and trying to keep my posture as erect as possible. And trying to sustain that for any length of time in a classroom was just very taxing and difficult, and it was almost physically irritating. And that is essentially what it's like to have a postural disorder that is amenable to intervention from an occupational therapist. Your body just can't tolerate or can't process in space what it's like to be straight and be erect. The other type of sensory-based motor disorder is referred to as apraxia. And apraxia, typically when you think of an occupational therapist thinks of apraxia, they might have to do with being uncoordinated. They may have difficulty with catching a ball or participating in athletic activities, and that is absolutely true. When you think about professional athletes, who are essentially professionals at sensory processing and praxis, which is basically the ability to coordinate activities that involve information from the senses and one or more body parts that's referred to as praxis. And so apraxia is the fancy Greek term for the inability to carry out activities. A meaning not, and apraxia meaning doing, essentially. And apraxia is really the biggest barrier, the biggest demon of a lot of kids, and certainly me, was ONH in our lifetimes, because it can affect everything from fine motor skills, the ability to, just do even the basic things, such as just getting your underwear on in the morning, getting your pants on in the morning, buttoning. I actually didn't learn how to button until I was in the second year of 3 summers. I attended a program for youth with blindness and visual impairment in Cincinnati. It was actually the Clovernook Center for the Blind. I could tell you the exact day I learned how to button, and it was just absolutely the best thing in the world. And the amount of time and effort and training that it took for me to learn that skill, because I had such difficulty coordinating my body, my hands, to be able to perform such a basic task as, and I'm demonstrating it right now, buttoning a shirt. You take the button with your right hand, and then you feed the button into the hole, which is in your left hand. And I'll never forget what actually allowed me to perform the skill. It was this teacher I had, who was a daily living skills teacher at Clovernook School for the Blind, which is a program I had attended. Second year I was there, said, okay, when you're buttoning a shirt, you take the right hand, to button your right hand, and you feed the button, you put the hole, the button hole, in your left hand, and you feed the button through the hole with your right hand, and then when it comes through, pull the button and your right hand with the the right hand where your button is, and the right hand was you put the button through the hole, and the left hand pull both in opposite directions. And I'll demonstrate. You take the button is in my right hand. I have my button hole, which is in my left hand, and I've fed it through, and I'm feeling it come through in my left hand. So now this button is in my left hand, and pull that button, which is in my left hand and which is now crossed in my right hand, pull in opposite directions. I can tell you the exact date and time I learned that skill. And that was, all of these types of skills that I had to learn, it took tremendous amount of time and energy and effort on the part of multiple TVIs that I had, my teachers I had, occupational therapy I was into, my school district, and most especially and most importantly, my mom, who was just, you'd have to, she needs to be a saint, she needs to be sainted. Just the time and the energy that it took to really process, to really teach me that skill. And there is actually 2 more points that I want to discuss in terms of the sensory processing. It really gets to the crux of how a lot of us process information. I think it's really important to understand when you're developing, if you're a TVI, you're a classroom teacher, or you're a professional that is involved in the planning process, and you have one of our kids in a caseload, on your caseload, or you have your parent that is trying to interact and trying to teach a child with ONH, just even the basics. One of the things that can be very important to understand is it can take a lot of trial and trial and trial, and just you're beating your head against the wall trying to teach us these skills. But understand that the difficulty we face and some of the things that we are doing, some of the behaviors that we engage, such as rocking, such as your hand flapping, and other types of behaviors, repeating, echolalia, all this good stuff. We're not doing these types of things because our brains are working properly. We're doing these things because we need certain types of stimulation. And one of the things that is really important to understand about how we learn skills is that once we do learn skills, like buttoning, for example, it is etched in our memory forever. I can tell you the exact date that I learned to button my shirt. It was July 13th, 1987. It was 1:46 in the afternoon, Eastern time, on a Tuesday. And I'm just giving you this sense because a lot of our kids, autobiographical memory, photographic memory, eidetic memory is really kind of important in that context. But once we get past that point to the fact that we are able to learn, to process and really learn that skill, it is etched in our memory, and we are constantly able to perform that skill. It's almost as if there is a file that is in a database that contains that particular skill, and the file didn't either download because of a communication issue or a processing issue. We just don't have the application in our brain, the software application, to be able to run it effectively, or be able to read or interpret the data in that file correctly or adequately until that skill is actually taught. And then, like for example, after that date, I was buttoning my shirt. I was literally able to button my shirt as I'm doing now, no difficulties whatsoever. And it's like that with so many skills, at least in my context and in many others, including speech in a lot of cases. I've seen kids that have been able to, who are completely nonverbal or functionally nonverbal, who were able to all of a sudden start speaking complete sentences or speaking words. And it can start as late as 9. I was actually at a conference in Pittsburgh a number of years ago, and I actually was with a TVI, and there was a young lady who was 9 years old, and I remember she was using a cane, and our canes touched, and her words literally were, "I scared myself." And this teacher came up to me and said, that's the first word that this particular young lady said that was not echolalic. So, this is really important to understand the impact, and as I mentioned this because I discussed the types of sensory processing, but the impact of Apraxia, the Apraxia and the other types of processing characteristics can have, and how it can really impact the learning process. I want to just take a quick moment to discuss vision, and that'll conclude today's presentation. As the vision of children with ONH typically, as I mentioned, can be mild, can range from mild to severe. It is characterized, most children, if not all children, have nystagmus, which is the involuntary movement of the eyes. And as I discussed earlier in the last talk I gave, the last part, the earlier part of my workshop, which is posted last week, nystagmus is usually, if not always, involuntary. Our children, I, for example, I know I'm showing nystagmus right now because I would almost have to be for all the hours, all the minutes doing this presentation, but I don't always realize that I'm doing it. My eyes are doing it, but it can wreak havoc on my ability to process visual information for any length of time. And one of the things about using a CCTV is staring at a CCTV for any more than 10 minutes can physically make me exhausted. And I used to have headaches and severe eye strain and what have you just because of nystagmus. Also, vision with ONH, my vision and a lot of other, I have astigmatism also, and high myopia, and in my case, power in my optic nerve, marked temporal power in my optic nerves, which is the front of my optic nerve, is very pale. And what I perceive is so narrow that pretty much all I can see is a dot in front of me, maybe 5 feet in front of me. I have no peripheral vision. I know what peripheral vision is intellectually, but I have no concept of really what peripheral vision is other than intellectually. And I also, anything that is outside of my visual field, I do not perceive. From the standpoint of vision, it might as well be as if that, whatever that object is in front of me, it might as well not exist. And this is important to understand because a lot of children, this can be the case with some kids with ONH. Some kids with better usable vision than I do also demonstrate strabismus, which is the crossing of the eye. It may be referred to as lazy eye. They may do this. And that can make any kind of visual processing or using anything visually for any length of time difficult, if not impossible. And this is one of the main reasons why I believe that when you're dealing with a child with ONH, you need to constantly be exposing that child to Braille, because Braille vision may not be a viable means of processing information all the time. They may need to revert to Braille for certain activities, or they may need to use Braille exclusively for many activities or many tasks, just because staring at a blackboard or staring at a printed page, especially if it's large print or with a CCTV, when your eyes are bouncing around inside of their head, inside of their sockets like ping pong balls, can be very difficult. It can be extremely taxing, and it can be very arduous, and it can really lead to, if you're already compromised as far as what you can process sensory-wise, it can really lead to a lot of behaviors, as I'll discuss later on. So I strongly encourage, as a matter of fact, I think it is an absolute necessity that if you have a child with ONH, if you're working with a child with ONH, you need to be looking at Braille. You need to be incorporating Braille in that curriculum, even if it's just exposing that child to the first 10 numbers or the first 10 letters of the alphabet, A through J. Even if it's just that, it's better than nothing. Because I do understand it as much as I do that many kids are tactually defensive, and certainly I was very tactually defensive. But understand that Braille, it's really no way around it. Braille is absolutely essential. Now, I feel like I kind of jumped around in my presentation just a little bit. I will discuss the next segment, which is the final segment in this 3-part series next week. I will focus on behaviors, many of the behaviors that arise and related to sensory processing disorder and autism characteristics. I will discuss how I manage my own behaviors, and I will also discuss educational strategies, the services and supports and different interventions and different things that really help me and have helped other kids and helped adults that I've worked with achieve their full potential, and some of the things that certainly we deal with, I deal with on a daily basis. This is going to be, much of it's going to be based on my own experiences and personal strategies that I used, and a lot of it is going to be somewhat technical in nature, somewhat personal in nature. I will be using a couple of the neologisms I actually used as a child in this presentation that may be important for you to understand as readers and viewers of this video series. So I hope you're looking forward to this, and I wish you well, and we'll see you next week.